B.F.D followers, welcome back to part 2 of Let's Make a Bike Jig. I hope you had some success in getting your strong back or the skeletal part of the jig from the last video. So if you didn't quite get it done, I'm going to go through a little bit more on that part of it, just because I feel like there's some clarity and some instructional things that weren't quite clear maybe. So we'll cover that here in a second too. And then we'll get into the outrigg parts, like the head tube adjustment assembly and the tailstock, where the dummy axle is mounted for the dropouts of the rear axle. And then also the bottom bracket assembly. All right. So you're assembling your hard back, strong back part, the skeletal of your jig, and you found that you're having a little difficulty maybe joining it and didn't quite understand what I was talking about on how to do that. And so what I did is I disassembled the jig again, and I took a couple parts off that I want to show more detail on. And so here we are is one of the joining assemblies. And you would insert it into the hole that you cut onto the edge of your beam. And so it's pretty straightforward. You just take it, you just take this and you position it over the hole and you drop it in. And that's pretty much it, right? So all you have to do is make sure that that bolt is long enough to give you clearance to slide this into a groove like this one here that slides down the beam. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this beam assembly with the carrier attach point nuts already installed, and I'm going to transfer that whole beam over to the vertical section, even though it's on the horizontal right now. I don't want you to get too confused. I just swiveled it so that the assembly process will be easier. But you're going to take that horizontal beam with the two nut plates and slide that into the edge of this beam here until they're both engaged and settled. And then you're just going to tighten that to hold it down in place. And we'll talk about some of the assembly measurements that you have to make and agree upon to carry out through the whole jig assembly process. It's going to be very important. Okay? Going to align that nut plate with that and slide her in, and then rotate as necessary, as needed, like that, and slide it in. And there you go. You can see that it's held in place. It's not tight yet, but for right now, I'm just going to pull this up to a position that gets it out of the way, and I'm just going to tighten it down for a temporary hold, as I said. So I take my hex wrench in there and just go and slowly tighten it down. Do both sides, even though you really don't need to at this point, because we're just doing a temporary tighten. So you just don't want this beam to slide off when you rotate your jig around. And there you have it. Sturdy. And there you go, see? Okay, well, I got a little warm, so I had to take the hat off, and now you all know that I'm actually bald. Okay, so we have that strong back all assembled, right? You got your Z angle and everything going. Anyway, that was a bad angle. I don't have a whole lot of cameras, so anyway, the next thing that we need to talk about is the bottom bracket assembly rod, and it's pretty simple. You don't have to do it the way I did it. You can just use a straight threaded rod. I ended up cleaning up part of it so that it was a little smoother and it worked with an existing set of cups. But you don't have to do that. And that's what I want to make sure everyone understands. This is your jig. You do it the way you want to do it and make the necessary adjustments to make it work. Okay? Now, here is, it's just threaded rod, 1/2 inch, because that's what I ended up wanting to have. And as you can see, I ended up milling off, or actually I used the lathe to clean up the end there so it's a little smoother, so that my cups that I made, for example right here, would slide on to this. And because I made this with the prior iteration of my last jig, I didn't want to have to make everything new again, so I put this onto the lathe and milled it down. So you don't have to do that. You can just keep it all threaded like this. And you can see my high-tech method here, where I just used big ass nuts, right? And the reason why you see 3 of them, and there's actually there's 2 of them here, but I use 3, and this is to set the adjustment for the bottom bracket going on the outboard, and then this nut here is for tightening it down onto the jig itself, along with one on the back side. Okay, and so what I'm going to show you now is how I did that. And part of that also has to be the hole that I drilled into the seat tube assembly beam. Okay, and you should try to make that hole as close and tight a fit as you can, so that you don't have a lot of slop, because you don't want this moving around that much, even though you're going to have bolts on both sides and washers, which will help as a stabilization plane. But the tighter fit that you have, the better, and make sure that when you drill the hole that you get this as 90 degrees as possible, because you don't want the bottom bracket assembly being on an angle. If you do this, if this is not 90 degrees to the beam, you're going to have problems with your build. Okay, so it's a necessity that this be 90 degrees. I got my seat tube beam here, and you can tell what side I had it on because it has all the scuff marks. So what we do is you get your washers, make sure you have your washers in place. I'm going to take my beam, and I'm just going to run the thread rod through there, and then the mating hole in the vertical beam. And there you go. That's how it's going to pivot about the jig, right? So now on the back side, I just got another set of washers and a nut that's going to hold this tight enough so that it doesn't flop all over the place, along with another little clamp that runs along the horizontal beam here. There you go. The last part of the seat tube assembly is this neat little fandangled thingamajiggy. And it's a simple little block that has a little lip on there that grabs the edge of the seat tube beam, and then has a nut plate here that then slides down the top beam, and it goes something like this. All right. like that. Slides down, and then rises up. And once you have your seat tube beam in the place that you want it, right? You can lock it down with this little clamp. Just like that. And you can see the beam is locked in place now. And that sets your seat tube angle relative to the rest of the jig. So that's basically the skeleton, your strong back of your jig all assembled. And now it's putting on all the peripheral type stuff. And this is where I'm taking some shortcuts on this, because the way I did it is I used a small bench mill to make some of these parts, but you don't have to do that. For example, you can take aluminum blocks that you can buy online that you can take that are close to the same size as your 80/20 aluminum that you purchased online, and they don't have to be exact. Like this right here is 2 and 2 1/4, 2 1/8 wide, and this goes on to my head tube, not head tube, I'm sorry, my seat tube jig, and slides up and down here. Right? So you don't have to have a perfectly matched up, beautiful looking frame jig if you don't have the money to buy the tools to do your own milling and lathe work. So don't fret. So let's look at each part here. Right here I have the faceplate. This is the main interface part to the jig itself. And as you can see, I have a slot that's been drilled out in here, and that allows for the assembly, head tube assembly, to actually pivot about that, right? And that gives me my angularity to the jig itself. So this is the interface to the jig, and it stays normal to it. This part is the big assembly here, and it's made up of the biggest, heaviest part, right? And I left the cone on there so you just see it real quick and how it might work here, right? And so this is going to be the lower section where the bottom cone of the head tube will sit down on here, right? And the pivot point is right here, and I have a common pivot point there, and it sits in here, and then it has a fastener that reaches through and grabs the backside of this plate, and it allows me to spin it like this and then lock it in place. And then this block just sits up here. Like this. And it has a hole on the back side that allows me to attach a knob fastener and tighten it down, and it allows it to ride up and down. And of course, I then have my last cone that sits in there like that, and it will sandwich the head tube. Okay, so let me go ahead and kind of get this all assembled, and I'll show you what it looks like when it's done. So you're probably kind of wondering, now how do I get that curve in that plate? And how do I get that slot in that other piece of aluminum? Well, it's not as hard as you think, okay? I went through that same thought when I was beginning and putting my jigs together. And what you do is you measure it all out and determine the arc radius, the arc. You determine the arc on your plate from the pivot point down here. Okay. So you'll drill a whole bunch of holes through this plate, and then you'll take a file and work your way through each of those and clean them up. And it takes a little while, and it doesn't have to be super pretty. You just want to make sure that when your head tube assembly rotates, pivots about that center point, that it doesn't bind like that. All right, so you just want to go get that file in there and clean it up so that it will spin about that axis. All right, does that make sense? And you do the same thing with your main beam here so that you have an adjustment for your head tube cone to slide up and down and then lock it in place. Now, what you'll notice is that I didn't put a center pin on this one, so I have to manually rotate this to keep it normal to the beam itself and then tighten it down. It wasn't as critical because of how this goes together and whether or not the head tube kind of moves one way or the other. It's always in line with the frame. So if anything, I'm losing maybe a quarter a degree in accuracy, but I design my frames and I specify plus or minus about a degree. All right, because you got a fork on there, you got tire squish, you got, so you can have some slop as long as you let everyone know if you're building for someone that there's a plus or minus aspect of your design. All right, so here we go. Just going to go ahead and do the assembly here. Okay, got my cone on there. Beautiful cone. Oh my God, that almost sounded like Trump. I'm sorry, didn't mean to get political there. All right, and so I just mate that up there. And there you go. And like I said, loosen that up and we'll go up and down, right? Depending on the size of head tube that you require on your build. Now, when you do this, the important thing here is that these cones be at the same level, okay? Very important. Yeah. So make this large enough, right? And then make a note of the distance from the bottom of your plate make a note from here to the center line of your cone. Okay, that's going to be very, very important here in a little bit. All right, just make sure that you have that dimension, because that dimension needs to carry over to your tailstock assembly for your dummy axle. Actually, this needs to be redone too. And it correlates also to your bottom bracket distance. And that's why I said we'll come back to this, because all that has to be on the same plane. Otherwise, your frame will be cattywampus and crooked, and it won't be a fun ride. All right, more on that here in a bit. All right, so here we go. There are my nut plates here that are going to ride into the jig and hold it in place. And this is just a tightening fastener. Helps prevent the jig from, or the assembly from rotating. A little tight, need to loosen that one. There we go. And that's a good place to put it for right now. I'm just going to temporarily lock her in place. And this one back here on the underside, this is what I didn't like. I use this just as a locking nut plate for rotation. And that nut plate just reaches around on the back side there and gives me something to bind it so that it will give that some friction, additional friction I should say. Just like that. That way, if this is really loose, it adds a little friction about that pivot point, and I can adjust it then after the fact. Yeah, that's not bad. So, lock her down for right now. All right. And we're 80% done. Okay, now we're almost done with our jig, and all we have is the last part, which is going to be the tailstock section of the jig. And because I didn't like the way mine was, I'm going to actually rework it and show you what I'm doing. So here we go. To give you an idea of what you can get away with, I'm going to show you what I'm going to be using to make my tailstock. It's just scrap aluminum, some 80-20 scrap, a steel rod, and a caliper, and an angle. That's pretty much it. Okay, so let's take a look at that. So here you go. This is it. Some chunks of aluminum. You want to have something that's at least a ½ inch, I would say, but you know, you can get away with something a little thinner, but I would stick with things that are going to give you some rigidity. Okay, and here's my 80-20 aluminum piece, and I'll show you again what that's going to be for. This is a dummy axle that I created for holding the dropouts that go on the ends here. So when you do your chain stays, it holds it in the proper alignment. And this has a groove cut in it that matches my arbitrarily cut diameter or width of the 80-20 aluminum. And that just gives it something to sit on. And then I just use one of these little clamps here to hold it in place. And it locks it in and holds it pretty steady. does a good job. It doesn't have to be super hard clamped because you're not putting much load on those. I'm going to mount this onto this plate here and give it a little bit of adjustment. But the key thing here is going to be keeping this parallel to this top surface, because I'm going to use that angle to mount onto this. That's going to give it a 90-degree relationship to this. Then this is going to be mounted onto the jig. And I know I just ran through that really quickly, but you'll see what I'm going to be doing. And so this will end up mounting and sliding along like this, just to make some fine-tune adjustments. Does that make sense? It will. All right. Okay. So I got the pieces cut, and now I'm going to lay out the hole requirements for mounting the main beam bar to the jig. And so what I need to do is pick up these slots. And so I want to get the fastener to be able to ride down here all 3 holes. I only need to do 2, but I'm going to use 3 to help take up any slop and make sure that I don't get any kinking around when I do slide the rail down the rail. Okay, so my 80-20 aluminum is 1.5 inch spacing. So that's what I'm going to put onto the beam over here, or the bar, right? And so what I've done is I've scribed a line that is from the top of the jig down to the first edge of the first hole, right? So like I said, I scribed the line from the top of the jig down to the edge of the first hole, and then each hole or slot is about 31 thousandths. So all I did is I halved that to come down to find the center of that slot. So that would be 15.5 thousandths. Okay, and so that's my center line of the first slot, and now I'll just go down 1.5 inches to pick up the next 2. So I'm just going to take my calipers here and go down 1.5 inches. And so I'm just going to put my scribe. It's nice to have one of these really thin scribes, because you can take your calipers and lay them there and pick up really close precision to where that edge of the center line will be. And then take your angle, place it in there. I know you can't see it, but you will in a second. And then scribe your next center line for the second hole or slot. And there you go. There's the second one. And then I'm just going to repeat that now. Now, here's something just nitpicking. You can carry over and say, okay, I'm going to go another 1.5 inches by scribing off that. The only downside to that is that if you have any errors, let's say there's a couple thousandths from here to there, from this line to that line, and then you do it again, and you go from that line to that line, now you've just introduced, let's say, 4 thousandths of an error. So proper way to do it would be to now just go a total of 3 inches down from this line. So 3 inches from that line to there. there you go. 3 lines represent the slots. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I decided to make a small change on the fly here, and what I've done is I decided I wanted, rather than having this down here, which might give me some access problems with the bottom bracket, with the dropouts later on, I want to move this up so that it stands a little proud of this beam, like something like this. So what I've done is I scribed a new line using an angle, right? Scribe the line through there, and I'm just going to translate these locations back up to this new line here. And so these are just approximations so that this has something to keep it from tilting. So they don't have to be precise in distances apart. They need to be precise on this line here. So here we go. And that's why I use a scribe, so that, as you can see, this punch here actually will catch the line and make sure that I'm right on that line. And I'm just going to give it a good punch. There you go. And you might be asking yourself, what is this for? If you're not familiar with doing some fabrication work, this is just so that my drill bit, when I do the drilling, catches the hole and stays centered on that line, so that there's a relationship between this hole and this hole, and that they're dead nuts on. There you go. There you go. See, you can see those are pretty much the same. All right, and that's critical, because when you get your axle on your aluminum here, right, if this block is canted, that's going to cause your one end of your chain stays to be higher and lower than the other, and that will cause your wheel, when it's mounted, to skew off to the side like that, and it won't be in line with the seat tube head tube relationship, and that will cause the frame to ride at an angle. Small variations are acceptable, but you don't want to have the bike feel like it's tilting on its own. All right, so there you go. Now you can take a closer look at my dummy axle. Pretty simple. It doesn't have to have these cutouts, but it helps. You can scribe a line like this, and then make sure that when you mount them, that they line up. Again, a few thousandths either direction is okay, but you wouldn't want to be that far off, right? That would make your whole frame off kilter, and your tire would not line up behind your seat tube. All right, so this is just I'm gonna go over to the saw and take off this excess material here, and then what we'll end up doing is doing the same thing with this piece here. Take off this excess material, and then what I'll end up doing is drilling holes in this to mount onto the jig itself. All right. Now, just a note, where I drill my holes on this bar now is almost immaterial, because all I cared about was that the fasteners are the proper distance apart. So I could have a hole here, and a hole down here, and yet when they slides onto the jig itself, that spacing will be correct. So the holes don't have to be all straight in a line. As a matter of fact, I don't know that I will. Maybe I'll offset them. But anyway, just letting you know. So I don't want to bother you and bore you with a whole bunch of hole drilling. So I'm just going to show you the initial drill, I'm doing a undersize hole first, and then I'll bring it up to full size. And you can see I'm just using a basic drill press. Do thin materials without anything really. I really should have put some lubrication on there. That made chips a lot better that time. Okay, here we go. I got it all loaded up in my saw here, and I'm just going to do a quick cut and remove that tail. And here goes the second piece. Well, there you go. These are the pieces all drilled up, and I put the bolts through them with the nut plates on them. And you can see I have my clamp that I'll be using, my 80-20 scrap piece of aluminum that will be used to hold the dummy axle, my dummy axle, and by the way, you can actually use threaded rod for that too, but you would need to get some washers and things that will mate up to your frame right. Anyway, and then we have our simple plate that I drilled up. Now you don't need this piece here. I just left it on there because it was from the old one. And then this bar that we scribed the center lines on and put these nut plates on. Pretty straightforward. And we're going to translate that over to the tailstock beam assembly. So let's do our minor assembly here, right? Okay. So this part here is going to mate up with the jig. So that's my down beam, and this will be the outrigger that will give me a standoff position for the dummy axle. Now, the dummy axle is going to be controlled by this aluminum block here, right? So that's why we scribed these lines and put two fasteners in there with these nut plates. And these nut plates are just going to be acting as a tightening fastening agent and also as a centering agent. So you can see, I'll just slide that on. Right, and this is the adjustment I was talking about, because this center, the axle center line, on this axle has to be centered with the cone center lines that we talked about earlier, right? So this would go on something like this. It presses on there and it sits there, and then this slides in like that, like this. So I'll just do a temporary fasten again. And there's a little bit of movement in this that will rock back and forth, and we'll get that taken care of because this is crucial too, how the axle tilts. You don't want it to be out of alignment. So we'll just press this onto the, okay, and so when that's tightened up a little bit, then you can apply this clamp here, like yay, and that holds the dummy axle in place, and that's all it really needs. Because like I said, the load on there, if you have your fit up right, should be very minimum. And I think I cut my finger somewhere, because yeah, sure enough, I saw some blood here. Anyway, so now we go and we take this, and I left this on there, this little tongue, and it basically right now allows me just to position this, and it fits up a nice 90-degree, nice and normal to this one here, which will give me a relationship to the jig, so I can actually clamp this in place. Now, if I was going to take some more time here to show you guys, I could have that removed and just drill holes right in here to hold that relationship, right? Okay, so now let's just go ahead real quick and take this over to the jig itself. And here we go. I'm just going to rotate this up, line these nut plates up. This is actually the hardest part, is getting all of them lined up so that they don't move around. And there you go. Right, and I'm leaving blood all over my jig here. I have to go get a Band-Aid. Yeah, I got blood. I'm bleeding, help. There you go. Okay, so and I would just go ahead and tighten these down if this was the setting I wanted. There you go, Bob's your uncle. What do you think? Does it look good? No. Now, throughout this whole build, you've heard me talk about alignments, and the crucial aspects of this jig is the center line of your bottom bracket, right? And the relationship of this bottom bracket to the jig. So that's why this axle needs to be perpendicular to your vertical, or basically any part of the jig itself, because that's what dictates how your bottom bracket will align to the rest of the tubes, right? So if this is tilted like this, you're going to have your pedals and cranks are going to be at a weird angle to your rest of your frame. The same thing can be said for your dummy axle. If your angularity on that beam to this part of your jig is off, so is your bottom, not your bottom bracket, but your dropouts, and your chain stays will be weird, right? if your cone up here is too far in or out, it's going to pull your seat tube left or right. And that won't be good, right? The first thing you'll see is that your wheel, once you have it on your bike, is not in line with your seat tube, right? Now, that goes for your head tube. If your head tube's sitting in here and your cones are off and it's pulling your head tube off to the side, that's going to cause a misalignment to the rest of your tubes on the rest of the bike. So that's why it's really important to make sure that these dimensions, from this surface to your center line of your cones, this surface to the center line of this cone, the distance from this surface to the center line of your bottom bracket, and the distance from this surface to the center line of your dummy axle have to be in a line, in the same plane, and well, basically in alignment. Those are the key things to making a good frame. If those are off, you're not going to have a frame that's going to be looking very well or riding very well. All right. Here I just wanted to show you an example of my cone on my seat tube beam. Right? If I slide it all the way down, it lines up with the center line of my bottom bracket. All right, I keep saying that a lot. That's crucial. It needs to be in a line. So take the time to make sure that that's consistent throughout your jig. You need to carry that distance over, and that's where these big calipers were useful, because I could actually come in here and measure that distance, come in back here, measure that distance, and carry that all the way over onto all my parts, right? Just as an example. Now, the other thing I wanted to show y'all, let's see here. Get that out of the way. Was these cups. That hold the bottom bracket in place. Now, I know you can buy these online, but again, that's another thing that you'll have to go out and source. But you can also just go out and buy some really large nuts that are larger than the diameter of your shell, and you just take it to your bench grinder, and if you have some threaded rod, you can run threaded rod through it. Of course, it could be the same threaded rod that you're using on your dummy axle, or not your dummy axle, but your bottom bracket holder. And you just run it around and grind it down to the right diameter to slide into your shell. Now you want to leave a little lip on there so that it stops. And you'll need two of them. One is set to push out to give you the correct distance for the center line, and the second one is to hold it in place. And I just drilled a hole in there and tapped it and put a little set screw. And that set screw just keeps it from moving around. And you know what? That's the end of it. Once you have it, the rest are just niceties to have. As you start building, you'll go, oh, I wish I had something like this to do that. And like this little doodad. Again, it's just something I threw together really quickly. And depending on the size, diameter of the seat tube, I can adjust it, and it mounts on my jig down here, and it allows me just to throw the seat tube on here. Automatically hits the bottom bracket center, so I know that the tube is centered and straight. Just a nicety. And then there are other things that you can make to add to your jig, for like your chainstay, to make sure that they're braced correctly. I made this little device here, a little quick weld, and it slides on to the bottom, and it represents the offset for your bottom bracket and your crank, along with the chain ring. So I know that when my chainstays go on, if the chainstay hits this piece here, I know that it's too far outboard, and that my chain ring and or crank arm will hit the chainstay. It's just a quick and dirty way of making sure that I don't weld prior to getting everything adjusted correctly. Because the worst thing you want to do is get something all welded up, tacked at least, hopefully, and you check it and you go, oh crap, I got riding conditions, that's not good. And now you got to go and grind it off, and who knows, you might actually damage your chain stay and have to go out and buy a new replacement one, and it just adds money to the whole scenario. So whatever you can do to do it right the first time, man, take the time, figure it out. So I think we're done, and the next video that I'll start will be actually probably design, and then we'll get into actually starting fabrication, and we'll break those down into like head tube, miter ring, chain stay, alignment, and all those good things. Okay, so all right, stay tuned, and we'll be right back, coming back to you real soon. Look for it. This is going to be the fun part, and can be the most frustrating part, especially if you're new at welding. But hey, that's why we're here. This is to have fun. Make your very own custom frame. All right.